Hey guys, I'm Chris Buck, and a very warm welcome to Friday Fretworks, and this week, the first Gibson Les Paul ever made. Well, maybe. Possibly the first time in the history of YouTube, that opening statement, despite being somewhat provocative, may not actually turn out to be hyperbole. There is a very real chance that this is in actual fact the first Les Paul that ever left the factory. I've been very fortunate to play a handful of 52s in my time, but none that bear all the hallmarks of being from amongst the first batch which left Gibson's factory. Notably, no neck binding, an increased body depth by about 1/8 of an inch, and of course those horizontal adjustment screws on the bridge P90. It's estimated that less than 100 left the factory looking like this, so even if this isn't necessarily the first ever made, ultimately they weren't serial numbered, so there's no way of conclusively saying, it is still undoubtedly a piece of history. Gibson would go on to produce over 1,700 Les Pauls in 1952 alone, so to play one of the very first examples of what would go on to become one of the most iconic instruments in musical history is a very cool experience. And incidentally, this exact guitar is currently for sale here in the UK at ATB Guitars for a cool £32,500. So if you're feeling flush and have deep pockets, I'll leave a link down in the description box. Now, of course, it's an oft-repeated, albeit apocryphal tale that Les himself would actually design the guitar that would go on to bear his name. Now, funnily enough, he did approach Gibson way back in 1941 with the now fabled log guitar, a crude approximation of an electric guitar that, at least in terms of its construction, wouldn't actually turn out to be a million miles away from the ES335 that would be introduced some 17 or so years later. But in terms of the Les Paul, its design can actually be traced back to three people: Maurice Berlin, president of CMI, Chicago Musical Instruments, and Gibson's parent company; Guy Hart, Gibson's general manager; and of course Ted McCarty, Gibson's president, with Les Paul's primary involvement being to loan his name to market the guitar. Les was the perfect vehicle for Gibson's first foray into the world of solid-body electric guitars, very much their answer to the runaway success of Fender's Telecaster, with Les and his partner Mary Ford, both on and off stage, being one of the biggest duos of the era, with 28 hits combined between 1950 and 1957. A deal was struck, a royalty rate agreed, roughly $6.50 per guitar sold, and the new Les Paul standard introduced. Somewhat ironically, the one part of the creative process that Les himself was involved in was the design of the tailpiece, which, through absolutely no fault of his own, turned out to be the one major flaw with the guitar. Through a miscalculation on Gibson's part in regard to the required neck angle, what Les had envisioned as a wrap-over tailpiece had to be somewhat crudely repurposed into a wrap-under tailpiece in order for the guitar to be somewhat playable. Of course, this meant that you couldn't actually palm mute, which, again, somewhat ironically, was a major component or a major factor in Les's playing style. Such was its impracticality that very quickly on his own guitar, Les would replace the tailpiece with a Kaufman Vibrola, but by this time the production of the new Les Paul standard was in full swing, and as such, early 1952 examples don't fetch anywhere near the same money as, say, a 1953 or 1954 model, where the issue had been rectified. These days, there are any number of tailpieces that you can get for 52 Les Pauls, notably Mojo Axe and Glacier, to name but two, that not only remedy this issue, but don't actually require any kind of invasive work on the guitar itself. So if you have a 52 Les Paul lurking under your bed that you don't play, fear not, help is at hand. But for the rest of us, I can't say it's a particularly comfortable guitar to play. After the better part of a year of customer and player feedback, good and bad, Gibson would look to remedy the Les Paul's playability issues in early 1953 with a change of neck angle from 1 to 3 degrees and the introduction of the wrap over tailpiece, as per Les Paul's original design, in place of that original wrap under tailpiece, allowing for not only greater playability, but of course better tuning stability. Funnily enough, it's actually this exact spec of guitar, gold top Les Paul with a wrap over tailpiece, that is my dream guitar. No prizes for guessing where the spec of my custom Revstar came from, but with prices having near enough doubled actually in the last 3 to 4 years, can't say I'll be likely getting one anytime soon. But back to this 52 for a second. Aside from the obvious playability issues, and as I said, it is a little bit awkward to play, can't lie, it is an absolutely magnificent sounding guitar. Those early P90s really are majestic, open and woody, transparent, but with that signature bite and bark and growl that you associate with the great set of P90s when you push them. Incidentally, it's also worth mentioning that they're magnetically in phase in that middle position, which is absolutely not a certainty when it comes to those original 50s gold tops. I would say that of the maybe 14 or 15 that I've played, at least 50% of them have been magnetically out of phase as stock, which leads you, I guess, to the only natural conclusion that whoever was assembling P90s at Kalamazoo in the early 50s hadn't really figured out the relationship between a pickup's magnetic polarity and a guitar's sound. The guitar's intonation was especially impressive when you take into account that there's no way of adjusting it. A little off at the dusty end, admittedly, but you can probably tell in the playing footage that you just learn to accommodate for it and pitch and bend very slightly differently just to work around it. But I guess the one thing which did catch me off guard very slightly actually was that extra body depth. It's pretty subtle, works out about 1/8 of an inch, but going back and forth with a couple of other different 50s gold tops, it does, whether perceived or not, feels slightly bigger when sat in your lap. The neck had a definite V profile, nowhere near as pronounced as, say, a mid-50s Stratocaster, which could sometimes feel as though they have a spine running down the back of the neck, but it was undoubtedly there, but very comfortable and intuitive to play. And it's also worth mentioning that this was one of the weightier 50s Les Pauls I've played, weighing in £9 and 6 ounces. As I said, on the heavier side for 50s Les Pauls, at least in my experience, but by no means a boat anchor. As well as that extra depth, lack of neck binding, and of course those horizontal adjustment screws on the bridge P90, another subtle quirk of these very early 52 Les Pauls is the fact that the I in the Gibson logo joins the G. Totally useless bit of knowledge, might win you a pub quiz one day, although I highly doubt it. But all in all, this was a beautiful, incredibly cool guitar, and an even cooler opportunity to play such an important piece of musical history. Just because I can, I'm going to play you out now on another 50s gold top, this time an all-gold example from 1955 that I played in France a few years ago, which, from the sheer amount of times that I mention it on the channel, I'm sure you've already gathered, still has me waking up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat from time to time. It really was a sensational guitar. As ever, I'm Chris Buck, this is Friday Fretworks. Please subscribe, hit that bell icon if you haven't already, and I shall see you next week for another episode. Cheers, guys. Take care. I'll see you soon.